I'm Janie Cohen, and we're delighted to have you with us for Frank Korom's talk tonight. Professor Korom teaches religion and anthropology at Boston University. He specializes in the cultures of South Asia with a secondary area of expertise in the Tibetan diaspora. He's edited 2 volumes on this subject, titled Tibetan Culture in the Diaspora and Constructing Tibetan Culture, both published in 1997. He received degrees in religious studies and anthropology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And before pursuing advanced studies in South Asian languages in India and Pakistan, he then received his PhD in folklore and folklife at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to his arrival at Boston University in the summer of 1998, Professor Korom served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Institution, a Ford Foundation cultural consultant in India and Bangladesh, and a curator of Asian and Middle Eastern collections at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe. He's been awarded numerous distinguished research grants, including Mellon, NEH, Fulbright, and Guggenheim, among many, many others. And he's the author and editor of 9 books, most recently The Anthropology of Performance, published last year. He edited Religious Studies Review from 2001 to 2003 and is currently co-editor of the journal Asian Ethnology. He serves on a variety of editorial and advisory boards as well. And if this were not enough, he is also interested in film, ritual, and performance studies. So please join me in welcoming Professor Frank Korom.
Thank you for that introduction. Well, good evening. I'm actually going to bring a short film along to show you about a Tibetan painter who lives in New Mexico, but I figured we probably wouldn't have enough time to watch it. But if you're interested, you can talk to me about it afterwards. Maybe I can get you a copy. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me, for organizing this event, especially to Chris and Kevin there for recommending me in the first place. I really love Vermont, and it was just a perfect excuse for me to get back up here. And even the 5.5-hour drive here today was wonderful, you know, just peaceful and relaxing and so forth. So thank you for that. And I also want to say you're all very lucky to have a museum such as this one, of this quality and caliber here in Burlington, because, you know, one thing, I like my job and I like the people I work with, but one thing I miss at Boston University is the fact that we don't have a museum, right? We have lots of other stuff, and we have lots of great museums in the city of Boston, but the university doesn't have one, so I can't sort of get in there and get my hands on objects and stuff, right? Which is a great resource for students to have here, and also for the public. So you're all very lucky, and you should thank yourselves and everybody else for having this wonderful resource here. All right, so you know, I just had a chance to view the exhibit very briefly before the talk today. So I'm not really equipped to address the individual pieces on display there. So what I thought I would do would be to address the broader ramifications and issues that Tibetan artists today face in terms of trying to do their work, right? On the one hand, as you may have read in the abstract of my talk, Tibetan art, traditional Tibetan art, is about anonymity, the title of the exhibit here. But that means anonymity suggests also sameness and traditionality. That is to say, innovation and creativity is something that is not seen as a positive thing in Tibetan religious art. So the way that Tibetan art has evolved over the centuries is through what you might want to call, you know, plagiarism. You take the same theme, the same canvas, the same colors, the same geometric patterns, and you reproduce them as accurately as possible so that you honor your teacher, right? And that is how the tradition develops, right? Through sameness. So deviation is considered to be a negative quality. On the other hand, in the West, we value innovation and creativity. If someone simply reproduces something, we call it plagiarism, right? We call it copying. We look down upon it as being less authentic and so forth. So there's a kind of different worldview there, aesthetic worldview, in terms of the way Tibetans think about art and the way Westerners think about art. Now, as you heard, I'm interested in diasporas, what happens when people get pushed out or leave voluntarily from their own culture and get relocated somewhere else that might have a radically different worldview. And this is what happened with many Tibetans after Tibet was annexed by the People's Republic of China. And as a result of that, you now have a number of artists trying to grapple with these issues. Do I stick with the tradition and be embraced by my society, or do I innovate and get shunned by my society, right? And it's happened in some cases, some instances, where Tibetan artists who have deviated so much from the tradition that the politicos in Dharamsala, where the government of Tibet in exile is located in northern India, they've actually excommunicated people, right? By saying you're too deviant. We don't want to have anything to do with you. You know, you're not representing the Buddhist tradition properly to the West, so on and so forth. So these are serious issues for artists today. And I want to sort of step back a little bit and give you the broader context, historical context, to allow you to kind of, think about where the modern Tibetan artist who is a global citizen fits today. So to do that, Chris, could you turn off the lights? I want to just, I dug into my archive of slides here, and many of them still haven't been digitized, so some of them are a little bit dark and underexposed. I apologize for that. But I did a lot of trekking in the 70s, and the image of Tibet in the West is of a place that is kind of secret, inaccessible, mysterious, so on and so forth. And so the West had developed early on in the 19th century, even earlier, but primarily in the 19th century, as I'll talk about later, this kind of notion of Tibet as an inaccessible paradise, right? So you would have to climb across tall mountains, the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world, across glaciers, uninhabitable terrain, until you finally get to these places where you had a bunch of happy-go-lucky dancing monks who just lived kind of an idyllic life. It was thought that they would live for centuries, if not millennia, even that some of them were thought to be immortal, so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that Tibet was right on the Silk Road, so it was never as isolated as people make it out to be, right? It was only later on, when the British tried to colonize Tibet, that they closed their borders out of fear that somehow Tibet might be incorporated into British India. So the reality of this situation was that there was always trade going on, from the medieval period down to the present between Europe, East Asia, and Tibet, but it was often overlooked because this idea of the paradisical or Shangri-La image of Tibet developed. And it has a lot to do with this particular image here. There's one mandala image, Atanka, in the exhibit upstairs, which is a different one, but I'll talk about mandalas a little bit more later. But this one here in particular is called the Kala Chakra mandala, or the Wheel of Time mandala. And it's thought to, this one is a rug, by the way, which is interesting in and of itself, but it's actually done as a sand painting. You're going to have a demonstration here at the museum later in the month of how this is done. But the Kala Chakra mandala is an interesting one because it's kind of millennial in nature. That is to say, you get initiated into it, and it's a place where you get reborn to protect you from these evil forces that are going to overtake the modern world. It's a very complicated thing, but the Dalai Lama, for example, initiated 200,000 Westerners into the Kala Chakra in Madison Square Garden back in 1990. Where they did one of these huge Kala Chakra mandalas in sand right in the center of Madison Square Garden. Nowadays, artisans are transforming that sacred tradition into a woven tradition, if you will, and reproducing the Kala Chakra here out of wool and vegetable dyes to sell to tourists, right? So some of these sacred traditions are being commodified as a method, as an economic strategy for survival in exile. So this is from produced at a craft center in northern India near the aforementioned Dharamsala. And there are many objects, such as this one, which I'll point to later, which you can say are hybrid in nature. That is to say, they incorporate Western notion of aesthetics with Tibetan ways of thinking about art and culture and religion, right? So the idea of the rug, something to put on the ground or to hang on the wall as an ornament, was incorporated out of the Western aesthetic tradition, and then the motif of the Kala Chakra was something that was incorporated from the Tibetan tradition to create this new hybrid product for consumption primarily by Western tourists. Now, many of these Western tourists who come to Dharamsala and other places where Tibetans live in exile are looking for spiritual enlightenment. So they seek out people such as this aged monk here, and they look for guidance. People, well-known people such as Richard Gere and Goldie Hawn and so on, go to Dharamsala annually to seek guidance and to get instruction in wisdom traditions so that they can be better human beings and ultimately liberate their souls from this reincarnated world in which we live, right? So there's this kind of romantic tendency that goes on with the Shangri-La or paradisical image of Tibet. How did this image of Tibet evolve? Well, much of it had to do with popular literature that began back in the 19th century and continues to be churned out today. And I just want to show you some books that use this sort of image of Tibet, either as a place that is backward and you know, in need of reform and in need of progress and so forth, or as a land of bliss, and so a place to go to achieve enlightenment. So here's one example, a book by Amy McIntosh called The Man in the Sheepskin. And it's all about, you know, going to Tibet and discovering this lost paradise, right? Where you meet people such as this Lama here, who is supposed to give you instruction and make you a better person, right? Now, to get to these places, of course, and here's another one, Leslie Hallowell's Return to Shangri-La, was a big bestseller about 15 years ago, a little bit more than that now, on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a follow-up to the original Lost Horizon, where the term Shangri-La was first introduced, right? Shangri-La, of course, became a movie then later on. The idea, Lost Horizon, that is, became a movie later on. And it's all about, you know, going and finding this hidden valley where all of these monks live in eternal youth, as eternal youths, and they have the elixir of immortality. And, you know, the reason that they can maintain that lifestyle is because they're cut off from the rest of the world and so forth. So this is an old idea that is definitely there in the literature. And of course, the inaccessibility is pretty obvious when you look at some of these peaks. I mean, we're talking here about mountains that are all pretty much over 18,000 feet, right? Some going well above the 20s. And so it's not an easy task to walk, let's say, from the Gangetic Plain in India, from the tropical areas of northern India, across these mountains onto the Tibetan plateau. But lo and behold, when you do make that movement over the mountains and cross the threshold to the other side into the Tibetan plateau, this is what you behold, right? These kinds of moonscapes where you see these dry fields with these interesting little things known as, these things that are popularly known as stupas, that are also, by the way, laid out in geometrical form like the mandala that you saw in the rug pattern. So there's a kind of micro-macrocosmic relationship between the two. And this is what attracts people. This is what compels people to make those journeys over those high mountains to get to the other side so that they can go and seek out wise monks in these isolated valleys up in the mountains and study with them, right? In fact, there's one legend many of you may have heard about what did Jesus Christ do during those missing years in the New Testament, where he's a child and then suddenly he returns as a full-grown man. But what about the years in the middle where, well, there was a Russian fellow who tried to come up with evidence to suggest that Jesus actually went on a pilgrimage to India and ended up in a place called Ladakh, which is on the Tibetan plateau. Ladakhi speak a Tibetan dialect, and for all intents and purposes, it is culturally and ethno-linguistically a part of Tibet. Of course, there's not much evidence for that. I went to the monastery Hamas, where this Russian explorer claimed that Jesus spent his time. And I asked the head monk, is this true? And he just laughed and said, I've never seen anybody like that here. And I've never heard of anybody like that here, except for people like you with the long hair and the beard that come by, But we never heard of any guy from the Middle East in the past that came. So, but nonetheless, these kinds of legends persist, right? And so they create this aura, this magical aura around these places, which are very enticing to people who are starving for spirituality and enlightenment and so forth. And Tibet offers that to people, right? It was often seen as this uncorrupt place where people were all happy. It was a theocracy, everyone living in harmony, egalitarian in nature, right? No one suffered, everyone was happy. And you see these prayer flags just flapping in the breeze, and everybody is supposed to be living in harmony and all of that. But of course, that was never the case. Now, what about the artwork? After Tibet was annexed by the People's Republic of China, that's when the diaspora to the West began. First, of course, India accepted the most Tibetans. It's the closest. It's right on the border, Nepal and India. So you had tens of thousands of, after the Dalai Lama escaped from Tibet, you had tens of thousands of Tibetans, who left Tibet and followed the Dalai Lama into exile. And Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, gave him a barren piece of land which he named Dharamsala, and it's there that he built his government in exile. And Dharamsala produced painters such as Karma Phuntsuk, and some of his pieces are on exhibition upstairs. He now lives in Australia in the outback. He lives in a solar-powered yurt, believe it or not, and he paints with an airbrush. And he paints these kinds of idyllic scenes, again, hybrid in nature, where he tries to combine traditional Tibetan ideas and motifs and so on with what he has experienced in the West. And so this one he calls the Rainforest Buddha. It's from 1995. Another one of his, Buddha and Jesus. Okay, so this idea of perennial philosophy, that all religions are one kind of thing. But it's interesting the way, he puts these layers in here like that, right, to suggest kind of fragmentation. That is to say, not everything is harmonious and unified, that East and West aren't exactly, Kipling once said, East is East and West is West, never the twain shall meet. I suppose that's what Phuntsuk may have been thinking when he did this, to suggest that there are these attempts to bring religious traditions together, but then there are always elements that keep them apart. After all, much of the violence in the world today is caused by religious dispute. So Phuntsuk, the reason I chose to focus on him in these opening shots is because he was one of the first guys to deviate, and I don't want to use that in any pejorative sense, but he was one of the first to deviate from traditional Tibetan Thangka painting technique and try and paint in a hybrid style that would be attractive to a Western audience. By this time, his family escaped from Tibet and settled in Dharamsala, but then he left Dharamsala because people were complaining about his art being blasphemous, and moved to Australia and eventually married and settled down there. So he comes up with these interesting motifs, such as his Mao painting from 1992, where he shows, you can see the sitting Buddha there in the Bhumisparsha pose with the mudra of the hand touching the earth to witness the Buddha's enlightenment. Again, suggesting kind of the contrast between Mao attempting to impose his own form of enlightenment, the Cultural Revolution, onto the Tibetan people. I mean, Phuntsok doesn't elaborate in terms of explaining his art. Most artists don't engage in exegesis or interpretation so much. I think John Lennon once said, critics are bad artists and artists are bad critics. So that's kind of what Phuntsok believes. He doesn't talk about his work so much. He believes that the image should speak for itself. So maybe I shouldn't try and interpret it so much either, but let you come to your own conclusions about it. But this is a constant theme you find in his work, this kind of clash between not only Western culture and traditional Tibetan culture, but also Chinese culture and Tibetan culture, which is something I want to come back to a little bit later. This one is called A Cup of Tea on the Eighth Day. So it's his sort of interpretation of Genesis, right? God creates the world in 7, and then, instead of resting on the 7th day, he has an 8th day where God is resting after he creates the world. This is Tibetan modernity, or you could argue post-modernity. He even uses an airbrush for a lot of his work rather than using traditional horsehair or hog's bristle brushes. He uses airbrushes run by a generator in his solar-powered yurt over there in Australia. Now, getting back to sort of the 19th century, a lot of these books that were coming out corresponded with, as I mentioned, the British colonization of India, and then their attempts to get into Tibet before the Russians did, right? It's what Kipling called the Great Game, and it's really the subject of his novel, Kim. And in that book, you really get a sense of how spies from both sides were going back and forth to try and convince the theocracy in Lhasa to allow them to set up embassies and trading posts there, right? So the British finally did get in there with the Young Husband expedition, and that sort of opened the floodgates to the popular mythology that led to this development of the notion of Shangri-La. So I'm just going to run you through some images here very quickly. You see one here called 3 Miles High, The Land of Mystery, Tibet. All of these are British writers. From the Land of Lost Content. And here's The Call of China's Great Northwest, Kansu and Beyond. Some of them were more academic in nature, such as that one written by amateur geographers who were civil servants for the British government. But then you had, of course, popular kind of pulp fiction, such as this, that were intended for, youth. Even Tintin, the comic strip Tintin, has one episode called Tintin in Tibet, right? Tintin in Tibet. And so this was kind of a popular genre, if you will, of the time, where Tibet was used as a place of a land of mystery, as one of the titles called it, right? Or as a lost world where Yetis and things of that sort of lived. And then, of course, you had these memoirs by British officers, such as the Unveiling of Tibet. The language is very interesting. Unveiling, as if, it's a woman in a harem, and you're lifting up her veil so as to be able to peek inside in a voyeuristic fashion. And this is something that becomes part of the Orientalistic tradition in general in its portrayal of the way Tibet is presented and then later perceived in popular culture in the West. And then, of course, it was so difficult to get in that you had to disguise yourself, right? So people would kind of learn the language as best they could and get dressed up or pretend to be an Indian or something like that, just to get in there and sneak out, and then come home and write their memoirs up, hopefully to get a nice royalty for their retirement. And then, of course, you had some that presented lamas in a negative light, such as the Red Lama, where they became kind of like satanic figures, right? And these satanic figures would prey upon foreigners who happened to stumble by mistake into the region. Again, Roof of the World, Tibet, Key to Asia. So you had travel books coming out for adventurers who wished to try and sneak into Tibet. And of course, the most famous of those guys that snuck into Tibet was the Austrian Heinrich Harrer, who became kind of infamous for his book 7 Years in Tibet, and recorded the 7 years that he spent. He was an Austrian mountain climber who was imprisoned by the British in India, escaped with a colleague of his, and to get out of India and to avoid being rearrested by the British, they went to Tibet, and the Dalai Lama invited them to stay at the Potala Palace, and he became kind of a tutor to, Harrer became a tutor to the Dalai Lama and taught him about civil engineering and film and all these things. And the Dalai Lama, of course, was very inquisitive, and so he kept him on the payroll, so to speak, both of them, and Harrer and his colleague, and they spent 7 years there. Harrer then went back to Austria and established a little museum in his hometown. He passed away a few years back. And this is what they encountered when they first went there. They found people living in, kind of a traditional, but sometimes the language used was always in terms of developmental notions of backwardness and so on, right? They were filthy and dirty, and lots of descriptions of them pulling lice out of their hair all the time, and how they stank because they didn't bathe all winter. It was too cold and all the water was frozen. And naturally, it's not very pleasant to take a bath when you're out in a place like this and it's about as cold as it is outside right now. Imagine trying to get cleaned up in that kind of weather. But nonetheless, the views are spectacular, and this is one of the things. This is Machu Picchu, the southern col on the Nepali side of the Tibetan border. This is what attracts people and sort of keeps this image of Tibet as a paradise alive in the Western imagination. And then you have these serene valleys with these very placid lakes such as this along the way. And then you keep coming across these stupas, or chorten as they're called in Tibetan, which are reliquaries where relics of saints and lamas are kept and so forth, which attract people, pilgrims, and then also attract Westerners to them now, right? More books. Some of them, I was talking about the bad lama here again. You have a series of images about some people who snuck into Tibet and then get captured, right? And then they're brought up in front of the evil lama, and they have to, and then finally he gets his revenge and manages to break free and tie down one of the henchmen of the lama. And here you are on the Roof of the World again. More guidebooks. Now, this imagining of Tibet, the image of Shangri-La, was one that was first created in the West, as I have said, but it had a kind of rebound effect, right? Once the image of Shangri-La became established in the West, it got reincorporated into the Chinese worldview around the time that China started colonizing Tibet in the 1940s, right? And so what you started seeing then in Chinese popular art, that is to say socialist progressive art, were these images of Tibet, but it was mostly an eroticization of Tibetan peoples, right? Mostly women, but also men, as you'll see. So they became objects of sexual fantasy. Whereas Westerners were too puritanical to think of Tibet in those terms, they tended to asceticize the tradition by making everyone mendicants and monks in the West. Tibetans were all monks in the Western eyes. In the Chinese eyes, they were all sort of, people with voracious sexual appetites. So you see a lot of this kind of art coming out of that socialist artistic movement, which I want to say influenced a lot of Tibetan artists themselves who were studying art in China prior to their arrival in the West. And this is not something, by the way, that Chinese did with just Tibetans. They did it with all of the so-called Minzu or ethnic minority populations in places like Yunnan, where you have, hundreds of different ethno-linguistic communities that are considered Minzu, or these ethnic minority groups. So the women are always objectified in this kind of erotic manner, living a traditional lifestyle, carrying water and scantily clothed and so forth. And they were objects of desire for Han men who would go to these places just to enjoy the women. And so here you have pictures of different ethnic groups. The previous one was Tibetan. This was a group from Yunnan. And then some of them get more and more graphic in detail here with their naked bodies exposed. Bathing scenes. And this one is especially interesting because, it suggests kind of that notion of voyeurism, where you're up on the cliff looking down at these people bathing, and you're up there secretly with your binoculars watching. And then, this kind of imagery was then portrayed in the Chinese popular press. The superstitious, backward Tibetan Buddhists who were oppressed by the theocratic government of Lhasa, and they were in need of being saved, right? And that's how they justified and legitimized going into Tibet and annexing it, claiming that Tibet, of course, was always an integral part of China, the motherland. And so they would show these pictures of scantily clad pilgrims who. It's not unusual for a Tibetan to go on pilgrimage for 5 years, let's say, where they circumambulate the entire country, right? With Lhasa at the center, the axis mundi. And so naturally, sometimes they would have to bare their chests in order to wash their clothes or whatever. So these images were used to describe the barbaric nature of these people, how uncivilized and superstitious they were, and they were in need of liberation, of communist liberation. And here you have a series of images, of propaganda images of kinds of torture and various barbaric practices imposed by the monks onto the Tibetan people. Again, so this was all politically loaded, more so in the Chinese case than in the Western case, but equally political, one could argue, during the 19th century when this great game was going on between the Russians and the British. So here you get the beginnings of a kind of a synthesis, if you will, of realism and this communist kind of progressive art movement, and it was incorporated into a lot of the Tibetan works that were produced by some of the early artists like Karma Phuntsuk, right? So here you have a traditional tanka, but here you see again an image of a Tibetan man rebelling against the oppression of the monks. And of course, people like this who were living in poverty were saved and given clothes to wear, and then became kind of happy members of agricultural communes and welcoming with open arms their Maoist brothers who liberated them from the oppressive monks who ruled in Lhasa. And then, of course, they go on to become productive members of the Communist Party. Some of them even go into the military, as you see. And it's interesting here that this is done in a mandala and tanka-like format, right? Where instead of having a Buddha at the center, you have a soldier, right? An officer in uniform. And so it's, again, you see these hybrid traditions emerging using sacred art as a platform for establishing various kinds of ideological positions, right? Here you have Tibetan dolls that are found throughout China for sale. Here you have the happy singing liberated peasants of Tibet. Here's some more happy singing peasants. happy and singing around the campfire after working in the fields all day. Here you have an interesting image again, because it's symbolic of Tibet being the baby suckling at Mother China's breast, right, being reincorporated into the homeland. And here, this is even more graphic in a contemporary image, showing the infant that is Tibet climbing back toward the motherland, right? Very interesting and evocative image there. So this idea of Tibetans being infantile and in need of liberation and so forth is a recurring motif in much of the artwork that was coming out in the 50s and 60s. And it was Sino-Tibetan in nature, right? Tibetans were involved in it as well. And then you have, of course, examples such as this. A similar genre, by the way, was evolving in Russia at the same time. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston a few years back had an exhibit of Russian socialist art from the same period, and it looks very similar to this. So I haven't studied it, but it seems to me that there's a kind of a common sort of pattern there, a mirror-like effect, one influencing the other. So here you see the happy Tibetan cowboys wrestling up their, or shepherds wrestling up their sheep and so on, and then getting paid for their work rather than having to barter. And then Tibetan children happily welcoming politicians and so forth. We all know who that is, by receiving the katak here, which is the traditional white silk scarf that is given to a dignitary when they visit. And again, the Tibetan child sitting on the lap of a Chinese elder. And then, of course, the happy peasant calling the menfolk in for lunch, since they're out in the field working hard all day. And so, and here they are coming out of the coal mine. I've never seen a coal miner that happy before, I don't think, but they seem to like it down there, and they get their cup of tea as they come out, and everything's good. So the Chinese, of course, wanted to sort of propagandize the colonization of Tibet as being for the purposes of development. So here is one pamphlet that was published for a German audience called Große Veränderungen in Tibet, big changes in Tibet, right? And so what does this mean? Again, you see a tanka, right? What do these big changes bring? They bring objects of modernity, such as motorbikes and things of that sort, right? And all kinds of other commodities that you see being consumed around the edges. And again, you see the motif of the various Mingzi groups, the minority groups, being brought together harmoniously and incorporated into the Chinese, the greater Chinese family, the Han family. And of course, images such as this one, lamas sitting together with Chinese politicos and so forth, using again the tanka-like framework and style in order to send out these kinds of messages. One more time, various ethnic groups getting together as one. And then, of course, the most recent development was bringing them together on stage. You're going to be having a Tibetan performance here later in the month by some of your local artists. And it's very different. All of them are Tibetan. Here you see all the different minority groups coming together from different parts of China to perform on stage as one. So again, you have this idea of the land of mystery, but a book just recently came out by a scholar named Emily Ye, and it's called Taming Tibet, right? And she took that term taming from some of the official documents, right? That is to say, it implies this idea that it was a wild place like the Wild Wild West that needed to be tamed and civilized and brought under order in order for it to become a productive part of the nation, right? And so the land of the Lama has to give way to something else. Modernity has its pros and cons. Some people superficialize it One of the things that I did when I was doing my own exhibition back in 1996 and 7 was to collect items of popular culture, right, that used Tibet as a motif. And one of the best ones I came up with was this University of Shangri-La, Tibet. Of course, there's no such place, but it suggests that Tibet itself was a kind of university in which a paradise, a Shangri-La, if you will, where one could go to acquire a PhD in prajna, or wisdom. And these kinds of things then, were based on earlier imaginings in books such as that. But then with the diaspora, you had the emergence of the Rangzhen movement, right? Where Tibetans in the West were seeking patronage from Westerners in order to keep alive this Free Tibet movement. And you see there the barbed wire in it, and it's on a red t-shirt there, suggesting that Tibet needs to be really liberated, that what the Chinese did was really imprison Tibetans, and now they need to be freed from the clutches of their imperial masters. And here you see a Kala Chakra t-shirt. These were being sold at Madison Square Garden, as I mentioned when I mentioned earlier that the Dalai Lama had initiated 200,000 people in 1990. These were being sold just like at a rock concert, right, where you would buy t-shirts with the insignia of the band on it, but here it was the Kala Chakra. And so as the sun sets on Tibet, we can reflect back upon what all of this means. What I wanted to do for you today was just to bombard you with a bunch of images of both past and present to give you a sense of the dislocation between reality and illusion, right? We use our imaginations to try and think of Tibet as being one possibility, one potentially spiritual place, but in fact it is no place, right? The original meaning of utopia. And in fact what it is just an imagination. It's something that the Chinese imagine in one way, it's something that the West imagines in another way. So Tibetan artists then who are living in the West are dealing with this confrontation, with this issue, with this clash of cultures, and trying to make sense out of it. So what you see in sometimes ironic ways in the artwork on display outside is precisely that. A number of Tibetan youth trying to come to understand who they are, what their position in the world is, and how they can balance being a Tibetan and living a Tibetan lifestyle with living in the capitalistic West, right? And it's not an easy thing to do, and that's why in much of the artwork you see images and symbols that suggest tension, that suggest contestation, that suggest debate, right? And non-resolution and so forth. And maybe I'll just stop there and we can open it up for discussion. Thank you.